Because the wonderful things in Hello, everybody. I hope you're enjoying your break. As promised, I'm going to do a quick screencast on the rise of the Populist Party and what it has to do with the Wizard of Oz anyway. We talked about this briefly in class, but we lost a little time and didn't quite get through all the things that I wanted to do. So I'm going to go through this very quickly just to give you a little bit of background information to help you with your project, which is posted on the website, and you should have no problem with it. I'm looking forward to seeing what you do. So the Populist Party has a lot to do with the farmers and the farmers' discontent. The farmers were upset about a lot of things. They believed that the railroads were treating them unfairly. They believed that the railroads were overcharging them. And sometimes you hear about rebates. And of course, rebates is when you get a rebate, you get money back. A lot of times we buy a TV and maybe we get a rebate from Best Buy. And although that sounds good, the farmers believed that these rebates were being unfairly given to big business. Oftentimes, these other businesses had shared stock with the railroad companies, and they felt that these rebates were being unfairly given to big business. And of course, the farmers were being unfairly charged. The economy. This is where it gets a little complicated. And whenever you talk about the populists, you hear this phrase, free silver, free silver. And a lot of people don't really understand what that's all about. And it can be complicated. The shortest, simplest explanation is that we're used to inflation. We're used to prices steadily going up. And we think of that as a bad thing. A lot of times we get it in our heads that inflation is bad. And we think maybe about something that you learned in 10th grade with hyperinflation after World War I in Germany. So a lot of times we have this idea that inflation is bad. But if you have loans out and you owe money and you own land and you sell crops, slow, predictable, steady inflation makes it easier for you to sell the crops at a higher price. And when you take out a loan, as time goes on, if inflation is happening, that loan becomes easier to pay. So think about the older person in your life who maybe talks about how inexpensive their house was. They might say, a grandma or a grandpa might say, when I bought my house, it was only $60,000, and today it's worth, maybe 10 times that, They benefited from slow, steady inflation. So they took out a loan in 1965, maybe, for $70,000. And they slowly paid that loan back as inflation occurred. They made more money. Their house value went up. If you apply that to farmers, farmers were upset about deflation. They were upset about prices going down, and the prices going down made it harder for them to pay back their loan. So the farmer's solution was silver-backed money. What's worth more, silver or gold? Well, of course, gold is worth more than silver. If the money was backed by silver, this would help the farmers pay back their loan. So I know even that explanation might be a little complicated. You might need to listen to that once or twice, but that is an explanation of what the farmers wanted. Additionally, the farmers felt that the political process was out against them. They felt like they were underrepresented. This is an interesting issue today. Many people believe that the wealthy and what do they refer to them as, the 1%, have increased influence over the political process. This was the same criticism that farmers had. They were upset about the president, McKinley. They were upset about the tariff, and they were upset about the weather. And that's just because farmers always seem to be upset about the weather. That's actually not overly important for history. Farmers begin to organize. They begin these things that are really kind of like clubs known as the Farmers Alliance and the Grange. And these clubs are going to become a political movement known as the Populists. And the Populists are going to be incredibly influential. They're in many ways unsuccessful during their own time, but almost all of their ideas are later going to be adopted in one form or another. So when a political party runs for office, they often have a platform. The populist platform, they're farmers, so the Omaha platform is where it was issued, had a number of incredibly influential ideas in it. And as you're going to see, almost all of these ideas will later be adopted, even though I can't say this enough, they weren't successful at the time. So direct election of senators, the way the Constitution was originally written, people did not have a direct vote of senators. They voted for their state senators, and the state senators then chose the federal senators. Reminds me a little bit of the fear of the individual that we talked about when we talked about the Electoral College, my favorite thing. Referendums, initiatives, and recall. These three ideas are still in many ways a part of the political process in the West. Arnold Schwarzenegger was able to win the governorship because of a recall election. So what are they? Referendums. Referendums gives individuals an opportunity to vote on a specific issue. So if you think about the democratic process involves us voting for our senators, our congressmen, and then they go away for a couple of years, either 2 or 6 years, and they vote on all sorts of laws. We vote on one election. We have a choice between a Democrat and a Republican. There might be third parties, but they don't have a really practical chance of winning. And referendums gives individuals an opportunity to vote on specific measures. So this would increase the democratic process. Initiatives gives individuals an opportunity to put up certain proposals. And recall gives the voters an opportunity to take someone out of office without having to wait for them to serve their full term. Like I said, these are still issues that are popular in the West. Arnold Schwarzenegger is probably the most famous example in California. Unlimited coinage of silver. I talked about this a little bit before. This can be very confusing. The short answer is that farmers were not benefiting from deflation. They took out loans, and those loans actually became harder to pay back instead of easier to pay back. Usually when we take out a loan because of inflation, over time, the loan becomes easier to pay back. This was a very rare period in American history where we had deflation. So it made it very hard for farmers to pay back their loans. The stagnant nature of gold-backed money. And what do I mean by that? If money is backed by gold, you only have an increased amount of money if you find more gold. So it was this stagnant nature of gold-backed money combined with a tremendous amount of immigration and population growth caused money to become more valuable. And we call that deflationary economics, and it made it harder for the farmers to pay back their loans. So the farmers wanted to correct this. They didn't feel like they were trying to get out of paying their debt. They felt like the rules had changed on them. So they wanted to correct this by making money worth, long pause here, worth less, not worthless, but worth less. And we think of that as inflationary economics, and it would make it easier for them to pay back their loans. So this idea of free silver, we hear it quite a bit with the populace. Of course, we never go to a silver-backed economy, but during the progressive era, we're going to have the Federal Reserve, which I enjoy talking about in class. And the Federal Reserve is going to give the government the ability through interest rates to control the amount of money in circulation. So eventually this is addressed in a far less radical way. Graduated income tax. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. I find this stuff so interesting. It's so interesting how this is still an issue. The other day, I played you a clip from Rick Perry. I was talking about regulation. And in that clip, Rick Perry said that we needed a flat tax. And a graduated income tax is the idea that the more you make, the higher percentage of that income you pay a tax on. A flat tax would be everybody pays the same percentage of tax. So if I make, $20,000 a year, I pay 10%. If I make, $20 billion a year, I pay 10%. 10%, I'm still paying more if I make more, but it's a flat rate tax. The progressives, I misspoke, the populace, later adopted by the progressives, believed in a graduated income tax, which is the more you make, the higher percentage you pay. So not only are you paying more because you make more, you're paying more because you're paying a higher percentage. And I have a little graph I'm going to show you in a second. The 8-hour workday. Now, there are a bunch of farmers. Why do they care about the 8-hour workday? They're trying to integrate Eastern workers to their cause. They're trying to become more open to urban Eastern workers. And this is a coalition that the populists are unable to form. Poor farmers, poor industrial workers. Later, FDR famously is going to be able to work this coalition and make this coalition work. Today, that famous Democratic FDR coalition is kind of fallen apart, and we're going to talk about why. In many ways, the farmers, and I'm going to jump the gun here and talk about this now because I find it so interesting. The farmers, look at this. The farmers are incredibly liberal. These are all very liberal ideas. Today, when we think about the Midwest, it's one of the most conservative areas in America. So it's interesting to see how that change has occurred. And we'll talk a little bit about why that change occurred later. Government ownership of railroads. Of course, and the phone company, we never have government ownership of railroads and the phone company, but we do see increased regulation. So almost all of these things occur in one form or another. I talked a little bit about the graduated income tax, and I have a little chart here to show you. So this is a little bit dated, but I believe that a lot of these percentages are pretty accurate for today. But regardless, it's just the idea that I wanted to show you. So the more you make, the more you pay. That goes without saying. That would be true if everybody paid 10%. But the more you make, the higher percentage you pay. You may have heard of tax brackets and tax write-offs. And, so if I make, let's just say I make $130,000 a year and I'm in this bracket. Well, wouldn't it be great, ironically enough, if I made just a little less, if I made $128,000 even instead of $130,000 even, I'd be paying a lot less in taxes. So you may have heard of write-offs and tax brackets. And this is a very modern debate. So this idea that we're talking about the progressives today, one of the leading criticisms of this progressive tax rate comes in the form of a flat tax. So some people say everybody should pay one low flat tax, maybe 10% for everybody, but then eliminate all of those write-offs, eliminate all of those tax loopholes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. I just want you to hear how this relates to today. All right, moving along. Well, jumping the gun a little bit, I'm giving you the history first, then I'm going to talk about the Wizard of Oz. There were these groups of people who marched on Washington, much like our friends in the Wizard of Oz will march on the Emerald City. Coxey's Army was a group of indebted farmers who were upset about all the things that I laid out before, and they marched on Washington. We don't think of these things happening in American history. We think that we're a pretty stable government, but from time to time, there was tremendous amount of dissatisfaction among certain groups, and these marches and these protests happened. James Weaver, I love his beard. He looks like he could play for ZZ Top. James Weaver is one of the most successful third-party candidates in American history. We have a two-party system in American politics, and the Democrats or the Republicans certainly dominate the American political process. That's pretty obvious. But every once in a while, we have a third party that emerges. And what ends up happening with third parties, time and time again, is that one of the two major political parties will often adopt their issues. So when a major political party adopts the issues of, say, the populace, as the Democrats will do, there is no longer the need for that third party. So they had difficulty becoming more than a sectional party. They weren't able to unite those poor industrial workers. They weren't able to get franchisement for the African Americans who lived in the South. And if we look at an electoral college map, you can see that the third party was successful in the West, but was unable to tap into the South or the Northeast. It's interesting to note that you almost never see a third party win a state. So oftentimes third parties will get a general percentage, like I think of Ross Perot, who ran for the presidency in 1996. I'm sorry, misspoke, 1992. I want to get that right. Sorry. Ross Perot, who ran for the presidency in 1992, got a very high percentage of the vote, but wasn't able to win any states. So this is incredibly rare to see a third-party candidate actually win states. All right. The election of 1896, William Jennings Bryan versus William McKinley, is one of the most important elections in American history, because a lot of times we look at these elections and we say, well, whoever won, they weren't that dramatically different. These guys could not have been more different. William Jennings Bryan was a populist who the Democrats adopted as their own candidate. He believed in free silver. He believed in government regulation. He was an anti-imperialist. William McKinley was an old guard Republican. He believed he was supported by the banking industry. He certainly supported the gold standard. As a matter of fact, his campaign pin was a little gold bug, which represented that. He was an imperialist. He did not believe in government regulation. So this was a real turning point in American history. William Jennings Bryan was a dynamic speaker. He famously gave this cross of gold speech. You will not crucify us upon this cross of gold. And the Republican boss, Marcus Hanna, was a major influence. He was a banker from Ohio. And today we talk about campaign finance reform. This was a very early example of that. The banks had a tremendous amount of money to lose had America gone to a silver-backed economy. Can you imagine? They would have lost a tremendous amount of money if that had happened. So they supported McKinley with a lot of money. They owned the newspapers. Factory workers were threatened with loss of jobs had William Jennings Bryan won. So this was an incredibly important election. So that's the history. What does this have to do with the Wizard of Oz anyway? All right, you probably don't want to hear that song anymore. So I'm going to skip through this part, and we're going to talk about what this has to do with the Wizard of Oz, because this is where it becomes interesting. So as interesting as this can be, right? As interesting as farmers and deflationary economics can be. So L. Frank Baum was the writer of The Wizard of Oz, and we've all seen the movie, but of course it was a book before the movie. And he was a very ardent supporter of the Populist Party. Now, I have to say, this is somewhat debatable. L. Frank Baum has never come out and never came out. He's obviously dead now, but he never came out and definitively said that this was an allegory. But I always like to point out, I think it's an allegory. A lot of people think it's an allegory. But even if it's not, it doesn't even matter, because it works so perfectly. It's a great way to remember all of this content. So let's talk a little bit about this. William Jennings Bryan, we shared before, was this incredibly powerful, dynamic speaker. Think of the lion. He comes running through the forest. Let me at him. I'm going to get him. But in actuality, as we know, William Jennings Bryan is going to lose both presidential elections that he runs in. He's really not successful. And after all, when we think about the lion, we really remember his cowardice, right? All right. I talked about this one in class. I'll do it quickly now. The little people, they represent the Lollipop Guild. What's the Lollipop Guild? What's a guild? It's a union. The little people, a age-old metaphor for people who are underrepresented and not treated fairly. So when you see those, munchkins dancing around, really you're seeing a bunch of disenfranchised labor workers. The farmer, well, if it's a populist allegory, the farmer is the most important person in it. And who does Dorothy miss the most? Who's the most important character in that movie aside from Dorothy is the Scarecrow.
Oh, I'm a failure because I haven't got a brain.
No brain?
What would you do with the brain if you had one?
What would you do with the brain if you had one? You'd organize, right? You'd organize a political party to fight for your rights, to get fair treatment. So if the farmers only had a brain, they would organize politically. That's the message there. The Dorothy character, represents the average American, something that I often say, and something Woodrow Wilson famously said. He said, how do I know I'm an American? I'm an idealist. I love that quote. So Dorothy's a good person, and the average American's a good person. If the average American knew how the poor farmer was being treated, they would stand up for the farmer. They would walk with the farmer. They're going to Emerald City. Emerald City is made of green. Washington, D.C. is the metaphor here. And Washington, D.C. is all about the money. Money. All right. Glinda. We all love Glinda, right? Where would Dorothy be without her?
Are you ready now? Yes. Say goodbye, Toto.
Now, I'm going to go back to Glinda real quick. Dorothy, as we saw in that electoral college map, the populace cannot win without broader support, without a political coalition that includes New England, Northeastern workers and Southern African Americans. They can't win without that. So Glinda represents the New England populace. And every time Dorothy's really in trouble, Glinda comes to the rescue. Now, here's the most interesting part. Everybody loves the little dog, right? And Dorothy loves her little dog. Let's see if this will click for me. No, my audio is not working. That's okay. No big deal. Let's talk about Toto the dog. So Toto represents, now this is where I think it gets really interesting. Earlier in this screencast, I talked about how today, when we think about the Midwest, we think of the Midwest as being very conservative. And yet, when you think about the history of the Midwest was the most liberal of places. I mean, they believed in government ownership of railroads and business. They believed in a high graduated income tax. They believed in silver-backed economy. I mean, these are very liberal policies even today. So how did the Midwest become, some of the most conservative parts of the country? Well, I think when we look at Toto the dog and what Toto the dog represents, it helps us explain this kind of interesting phenomena. So the populace were primarily a political movement. And as a political movement, they're interested in economic issues, gold and silver, for example, government ownership of railroads, etc. But they're also very much interested in social issues. And this evangelicalism, this religious fundamentalism that's very popular in the Midwest is illustrated through the political movement of the Populist Party. So Toto, whose name is Toto, represents prohibitionists, people who are opposed to alcohol. A phrase that you may have heard, I am pretty sure it's gone out of fashion, but still used occasionally, is a teetotaler. If you're a teetotaler, it means that you're bringing with you tea. You're bringing your tea with you because you don't drink alcohol. You're a teetotaler. So the prohibitionists, who were not interested in economic issues, were not interested in political issues, they were interested in social issues. And the Midwest, as an area that's very much influenced by religious fundamentalism, and I'm talking about then. I think you could talk about that as an issue today, but back then they're very interested in religious fundamentalism. Let's look at William Jennings Bryan's famous speech, "You will not crucify us on this cross of gold." It's a religious metaphor. Later, you might know William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was famous for his participation in the Scopes monkey trial, where he argued in favor of creationism. He argued against evolution. Today, why is the Midwest, when you look at the Midwest, the economics of the Midwest is among the poorest states in our country. They might benefit from more liberal policies, but the religious fundamentalism, things like abortion, things like, to this day, creationism or intelligent design, gay marriage, prayer in public school, all these issues have a major impact on turning the Midwest from this liberal bastion, right? This incredibly liberal area to one of the most conservative parts in the country. There's a very interesting book called What's the Matter with Kansas, which talked all about this. And I'll just read what Thomas Frank said, how conservatives won the heart of America. And I briefly explained how that is. So again, not to be corny, but history really is about today, and understanding the past helps us have a better understanding of what's going on today. So there's a bunch of other things. I'm going to try to do this pretty quick. William McKinley is the wizard. He's the guy. You ever hear the phrase smoke and mirrors? William McKinley, the president, is hiding behind a curtain and distracting the American people with smoke and mirrors.
The great Oz has spoken.
The Tin Man, this is my favorite. The Tin Man represents the Eastern worker. Where do they find the Tin Man? All rusted out after he's been used and he's no longer of service. He was left in the field just to rust and die. That represents this idea that was very popular during this time period, that the dehumanization of the Industrial Revolution, that people are now just a cog in the machine. And the Tin Man represents that well.
The tinsmith forgot to give me a heart. No heart?
Again, speaking of the dehumanization of the industrial experience, no heart. The Yellow Brick Road, well, it's probably one of the most famous things in the movie. What's gold made of, right? Yellow bricks. Oz, the whole name OZ is how we measure gold in ounces. And that's, of course, the shortened version of ounces. So how many ounces of gold, how many ounces of silver should go into $1? This was the issue. And of course, this is the whole thing. Now, I'm trying to remember the what comes next. I don't want to jump the gun here, but movies and the book, anyone who reads a book and then goes to see the movie always says, oh, the book was so much better and the book was different. There is a major change in the movie from the book. And this major change has a lot to do with the Populist Party. So when they made this movie, if you've ever seen this movie, in the beginning it says shot in amazing Technicolor. This was an old movie, and it was one of the first colored movies. And they wanted to illustrate this great new technology. So to really illustrate it, they decided to make a change. They changed Dorothy's slippers. Of course, Dorothy's ruby slippers, you can go to the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and they're the most popular attraction in the whole Smithsonian Museum. But in the book, the slippers were originally silver. And obviously, silver-backed money was what the farmers saw as a great panacea. And all Dorothy has to do, what does the Glinda say? You guys want to hear my Glinda impression? Dorothy, you had the answer all along. The answer is your silver slippers because they represent silver-backed money, I think is what she says. And all you have to do is click those silver slippers 3 times. So when you're watching this movie and you see the ruby slippers, know that they're really silver. The flying monkeys scared the hell out of me as a kid, but they are Native Americans who are forced to work for the witch, and the witch represents the Wicked Witch of the East, and the Wicked Witch of the West represents Eastern and Western business issues. So, if you had any questions about the Populist Party and the Wizard of Oz, I hope that answered them. Have a Wizard of Oz party over break. Maybe invite all your friends, have some popcorn, and you guys can watch the Wizard of Oz and talk about the Populist Party. I can't imagine more fun. We will see you after break.